Madam President, because of the kind of strain in my voice, when you're ready, we'll call the meeting to order. But if you don't mind, you know, kind of being my mouthpiece, I'm going to channel.
I gotcha. I gotcha.
All right.
I can tell you're
You
struggling.
can do
I
you,
see
but
got your mask.
but channel a little me, please.
Sounds good. You got it. All right, everyone. Well, welcome to the Criminal Justice Committee meeting chaired by Councilmember Thomas. I'll try to do my best to be his mouthpiece today. Let's begin with roll call. Nathan?
Yeah, Councilmember
I'm sorry, Anita, go ahead.
Councilmember Thomas,
Present.
Councilmember Moreno,
Present.
Councilmember Morel, Councilmember Harris, Councilmember King. We have a quorum.
Right.
Let the record reflect that Councilmember Green is in attendance.
Perfect. Thank you so much. We've got one item on the agenda, but before we do that, let me move with the approval of the minutes. If I can get a second.
Second.
Seconded by, I think it was Councilmember Thomas. There we go. All in favor? Aye. All right, thank you all. The minutes are approved. And before we get to that first agenda item and I bring the presenters to the table, we had a really terrible situation and circumstance happen yesterday. So I do want to begin with the council expressing its deepest condolences to the family of the NOPD officer who lost her life yesterday in Gentilly. This is a just really tragic situation, and we of course are keeping her family, her children in our prayers. We are reminded every day of the difficulties of first responders with the work that they have. And we heard yesterday during a news conference, Chief Sean Ferguson spoke about, just the day in and day out pressures that our first responders face. I spoke with Dr. Jennifer Vagno, who heads up our health department yesterday, about what efforts really need to be taken to meet the mental health needs of those who are on the front lines in our city, particularly since during this past budget process, we added a big boost of funding to the city's trauma center, really increasing their efforts tenfold from being able to serve 500 individuals every year to now being able to serve 5,000 individuals every year. So I believe that, collectively with the coordination of our trauma center and with the guidance of our health department, we really have to find a way to elevate our efforts to assist our first responders as well. I know that Councilmember Green, this happened in your district. You were on the scene yesterday, and I know you wanted to make some comments as well.
Thank you very much, Madam President. And yes, I was on the scene yesterday, and it was actually a very unfortunate scene, as you can imagine. But I just want to say that in a way, two families lost someone on yesterday, because the families of the New Orleans Police Department, the people of the New Orleans Police Department, lost someone who was a good friend. There were a number of officers outside of the house, some crying and very distraught relative to the passing of the person who died on yesterday. But I also remind everyone here that just the previous week, the members of the New Orleans Police Department lost someone to a stabbing, who was an Uber driver, but someone who was well known, someone who was taking care of her mother at the time, and there's a GoFundMe account right now to support her family. But and interestingly enough, this morning, 2 officers from Bay St. Louis, Mississippi, were killed as they approached the Motel 6 in response to a call, I guess, of someone in distress. But yes, Madam President and members of the council and members of the public, it does remind us that certainly it's a difficult job, especially being a first responder and a member of any profession where you put your life on the line in the interest of saving others. And we as a council do play a role in making sure that those who serve us have the resources available to them that will help them to recover. Another thing that happened on yesterday when I was there was maybe almost as sad as anything else. There were two children there, a 14-year-old and a 15-year-old, her children. Student at Warren Easton, a student at St. Mary's Academy. And that morning they had seen their mother. That evening, they recognized that they were not going to see her again. And they also need trauma assistance. And I know that our Trauma Recovery Center will be available to assist them. So as a council, we should do everything that we can to let our public know that there is a Trauma Recovery Center to assist, and we are very, very supportive. But I do want to just thank the members of the New Orleans Police Department and our first responders and those in law enforcement and those in our community who have suffered, and just let them know that the city council is here to assist wherever we can.
Chair Thomas.
Madam President, this is, while we were having this hearing, even though my voice isn't at my best, that was one of the things I wanted to summon up enough of my vocals to talk about. We just finished the season to be thankful. We're in the season to be jolly. We're challenged by the violence that happens in our communities, the level of dysfunction and what's happening in our families and our institutions, and the challenges for how we begin to corral and suppress crime. But when I think about the police department and the work that Cecile Thibault did, Howard Osofsky, the work that Denise Shervington does, the work that Victor Sims, many of our noted behavior specialists, given the challenges of men and women in our police department, and when they don that uniform and put on that badge and they leave their house, they know and accept what potentially can happen. But then when they go home, mounted with what they knew could happen in the street, with the pressures, sometimes the politics and the conversation around whether we appreciate our men and women or not. And I think moving forward, I think we have to be mindful not only of how we talk to each other, but how we talk to and how we display law enforcement. My mother used to always tell me, how can you reach peace if you're the one being hostile, if you're the one being disrespectful, if you're the one being so demanding? And it doesn't mean that those things aren't warranted with that individual or with that issue. But given these times, as you have said, and as Councilmember Green has said, I think we have to find a way to communicate peace, even in our dysfunction, even in this environment. And hopefully we can continue to do the work, some of the stuff that you're doing, Councilmember Green wants to do, and find a way to do that.
Thank you, Councilmember Thomas. Councilmember Morrell.
I apologize for my tardiness. I don't have much to add, but I do want to add one thing. I don't know if it was covered. I have been, and this council has been, significantly concerned with the lack of transparency on deployment strategy. And let me explain why I'm bringing that up now. A point that I made months ago when we put officers on 12-hour shifts is that the amount of stress and trauma an officer goes through is staggering during the course of a day. There is a reason why almost every law enforcement agency does not put officers, specifically police officers or law enforcement, on perpetual, never-ending 12-hour shifts, because the amount of mental trauma that you're putting on them and the lack of time for recovery, it's unconscionable. And as you saw repeatedly when this council continued to ask the department, when are the 12-hour shifts going to end? When are we going to stop treating our officers like they're pieces on a chessboard in a deployment strategy that simply puts them in places without any accounting for what it is actually doing to them? When we fought and argued about civilianization, part of that argument, which was made over and over again, is that when an officer comes on duty and has a 50 call backlog before he walks in the door, when that officer comes in 50 calls behind with the tremendous pressure to meet a backlog that is never ending, with a department that is not prioritizing bringing the resources to take those pressures off of those officers, these are men and women who are doing tremendous work to keep us safe, and we need to honor and respect those officers, specifically those patrolmen who are interacting with the public on a daily basis. Police officers often do not see people at their best. They see them at their worst and when they're in crisis. And as we continue to work through what this council will do for this department, I return to that comment. We cannot continue to think that by overworking our officers to not give them the time and resources necessary to recover from their shifts, to put the pressures of solving the problems of the world on a patrolman's back when they really have no control over anything in their lives, including how many hours they work in a day or a week. It's not tenable. And as we move forward this year in the budget, as we move forward with looking at who the next chief will be, it is very important to me personally as a brother of police officers to say, I want to hear from the next chief how they intend to resolve these issues, how they intend to get officers off 12-hour shifts, how they intend to deal with the mental health issues incumbent upon moving them around the city in untenable situations with non-transparent deployment strategies, and how we're going to make them safer. Because I would argue that the tremendous amount of officers that have left this department, a lot of that's because of the pressures and the trauma and the hopelessness they feel on the job. And the fact that many of those officers do not leave law enforcement, they leave the NOPD, says that that is an NOPD problem, not just a general law enforcement problem. Thank you.
Okay, so we have one item on the agenda. Let me bring up Jeff Asher, along with our friends from the Fraternal Order of Police, Detective Augustin and Donovan Livicari. If you could come to the table, let me make some quick opening remarks as you all make your way. So the agenda item that we're going to be discussing today, it's the results of a survey. And this survey, I teamed up with the Fraternal Order of Police so that we could ensure that it got out to as many NOPD officers as possible. The survey really centered around working conditions at the NOPD, along with what were the actual incentives that NOPD officers wanted when it came to keeping officers within the department. Now, what's interesting is that unfortunately, until now, a questionnaire like this on incentives had not been administered. As I mentioned, the questions didn't just come from the city council. They came from folks at the Fraternal Order of Police, particularly Detective Augustin, who works so closely with the officers, so that we could really get to, items that maybe we weren't thinking about, but that officers had been really thinking about. So the results of the survey, and Jeff is going to go in great detail into them, but I just wanted to just briefly say what they showed, that the results of the survey, at the end of the day, demonstrated that the priorities for officers are pretty simple. They want fair and predictable pay increases and better equipment. And we also gauged officer satisfaction. Now, this result was not good. 86% of respondents said that they were dissatisfied with the department, mentioning cronyism, favoritism, and only getting promoted based on who you know and not based on ability and experience. So if we don't change, obviously, this level of dissatisfaction with the department, really not going to matter what type of incentives that we have. We, at the end of the day, have to really change the culture within the NOPD. And I think in my opinion, what this really demonstrates is that officers are really begging for fairness and for transparency, which I guess brings us to also the big issue that we're facing now. And JP mentioned it a bit, and that's on the selection of a new police chief. Who will be that next person to lead the department? Well, based on what we saw in the survey on officers' perception of the department, or what could actually be the reality of this department, is that this is really, the selection process is really begging for a clear, open, and fair process when it comes to picking the chief, that we are truly vetting the qualifications of this new police chief in an open and transparent setting, that everyone is able to understand the priorities of the new police chief. And I'll be, candid here. I think that the way that we achieve this was laid out in a letter that the council presented to the mayor just earlier this week on Monday, which said, look, let's do a search of local candidates, from, potentially other parts of the country. And then whoever is chosen, let's put them through the council confirmation process. And then everyone will be able to see that the process was fair, and that the person who will be the next chief is truly qualified and has the right priorities to lead the department. So I know I kind of went off on a side note there, but I just think that the results of the survey really prove that that's the direction that not only the men and women of the NOPD wanted to go in, but also the people of the city. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Jeff. But if you'd like to make some opening statements, Detective or Mr. Livacari, please do so.
I would, if you're done.
Absolutely.
I wanted to thank the council for their comments this morning regarding our tragic loss from yesterday morning. It's unfortunate that these things seem all too common around the country. You look at these surveys, and law enforcement is in the same boat with some other professions like attorneys and physicians, where there's a high number of substance abuse problems, and it's because of the stress and the things that were mentioned in your comments. I'm happy to see that this is prioritized, by the commission. As Councilman Thomas said, it's a dangerous job. We don't need to make things worse. As Councilman Morrell said, I mean, we're going to keep these 12-hour shifts as long as we need them. Unfortunately, I don't think right now that we have enough people in general to move away from them yet. But when we get to that point, we need to be able to do that, because it sounds like what I'm hearing is that the 10-hour shifts are probably one of the better ways to go, and they seem to be well liked around the country. But we haven't gotten to the point in manpower yet that we can consider switching to 10-hour shifts. We've made some progress with mental health, and it's nice to for that to just have. We have Chris Abbott, who has expanded the officer assistance program, which has really provided a terrific service to anybody who has problems that want to go seek some kind of help. I remember it wasn't that long ago that people would call me as one of the attorneys to say, I'm having this problem and I need some help with, and I'm not an employee of the city, I mean, I do my best to help everybody, but it's Chris is in a better position to be able to address these kind of problems. So anyway, I appreciate that, and hopefully we'll be able to expand the mental health awareness and services that are available moving forward.
My name is Mary Lou Augustin, and I wanted to thank President Moreno for allowing us to do this survey. I think from watching these meetings, you guys are very data driven. You want to see the data. And when I would watch these meetings, I'd be like, if only you could see what the officers really wanted. And, a lot of people will say a lot of the officers didn't get to take the survey. Well, now that they know that you're taking this seriously, maybe the next time we put a survey out, they'll know, hey, let's respond because action is going to be taken. And I think it's very important when we look at the responses that the officers see that there's some kind of action being taken. If nothing's being taken, no one's going to want to take another survey. And I think it's very important that they know that they have your guys' support. And for those that are watching, they want to see what's going to happen. They want what they put on here, and and we're just happy to have this platform to be able to explain it.
Yeah, I really appreciate you all because the partnership with you all were able to make very clear to officers, like, look, you're going to respond to this, but it's going to be kept confidential. And as you see from the survey, there's no way to be able to identify who any of the respondents were. So I hope that once they see the survey, they'll say, oh, wait, they really did keep their word on confidentiality and all of that. And Jeff will talk about this later, but one of the things that we are interested in doing is potentially doing frequent surveys, and not super long ones like this, but just so that we have a kind of a tracking of what's happening with working environments at the department, what's happening with morale, so that we can keep a constant gauge instead of just trying to respond when everything's already on fire. So anyway, with that, Jeff, I'll turn it over to you.
With all of the thunder stolen from the things I was going to announce. Good morning, council members. It's a pleasure to be here in front of you again. It's a pleasure to present the results of this survey, which I think are very different from any type of survey that's been done for NOPD officers. The only really publicly available surveys that we've had are from the consent decree monitors who surveyed in 2014 and 2016, but it was a very different set of questions. And I know, Council President, you asked me to include some of that, and it was just so different from the type of survey that we performed here that it really wasn't comparable. This is, I think, a very useful instrument for gauging officer. We talk about officer morale, we talk about officer attitudes, we never actually measure it. And so I think that this is an excellent way to be able to measure it, to talk about it. This is not a good news story. It is not a bad news story. It is just a story that presents opportunities for how we respond to them. And we got 268 responses. They were all anonymous, so we don't know who the officers are. There's not emails in there that we could publish or anything like that. It's entirely anonymous. 28% of commissioned officers right now, which I thought was excellent. And it's really encouraging to hear that that there are officers that we ran it for a week and there were officers that said, oh, I didn't see this. I wish I'd been able to participate. So very encouraging that we could have even gotten a larger percentage. The consent decree surveys were surveying a much smaller portion of the agency, and they were surveying a much older portion of the agency. So as I'll show in a minute, this really reflects who's in NOPD right now very well. So very pleased with not just the number, but it wasn't just leadership, or it wasn't just the newest officers that replied. It really was across the department. What we found is that surveyed officers, and we've seen this in the exit interview analysis as well, surveyed officers generally like their supervisor. They like who they're working with. They like who's immediately above them. They are not satisfied with the department. And what we found in this survey is that there's deep dissatisfaction with the promotional process and the transfer process. And it really goes across the entire department, and that really comes through in the data. We talked about the benefits. We presented, I believe, 10 different benefits as far as these are potential benefits. Which of these are the most important? I think most of the benefits that they found most important related to not just pay raises, but implementing regular pay raises, making it so that it's not every 5 years you get a pay raise, but it's every year that you get some sort of small increase to keep up with cost of living and other things. We went into this truly blind as to what we would find. I know that there were policy benefits that we went in thinking, oh, this is what they're going to want, and it just wasn't at the top of the list. So I think it's good to be able to say these are the things that they want, and these are the things that while some people really want them, the bulk of the respondents did not inherently want those. So these two tables show on the left how the survey responses were compared to NOPD as a whole, by rank, and on the right by number of years of service. On the left, you can see what we have is generally what you get within NOPD, slightly more sergeants and lieutenants, but generally in line with the percentages that you would expect if you just sort of did a random draw. On the right, you can see that we slightly undersurveyed the 20+ year range. We got 28% have 20+ years of the survey respondents, 35% of NOPD officers, slightly more 5 to 19 years than we would expect from a random sample, but generally within the margins of what we would expect, I think. And just as we go through, note that when we're talking about things like retirement, we're generally talking to maybe a couple more younger officers than we would expect. If we had more older officers, there's going to be more that are closer to retirement, more that are considering retirement with NOPD because they've already got 15 to 20 years of experience. So here are the tables for the satisfaction. We asked whether or not they are satisfied with their department, with their supervisor, with the promotional process, and with the transfer process. The blue are no's, the gray are yeses. As you can see, the blue is pretty prominent in the department promotional process and transfer questions. The top right is the supervisor question. That's an 80-20 split in terms of yes, satisfied with supervisor, no, not satisfied. I'll note that we've analyzed 150 or so exit interviews this year, and this is very much in keeping with what we're hearing from the officers who have left compared to the officers that are here. And so now we're talking about multiple data sources of understanding what NOPD officers or recently departed NOPD officers are thinking. And this is a very common theme: dissatisfaction with the department right now, very much satisfaction with their supervisors. And so I think that these are very, very important points when we talk about who is going to be the next chief. This is something that the next chief is going to have to grapple with. And if the next chief is going to be successful, then you can't look away. You can't ignore this. You can't say that this is fake data. This is something that is just has to be dealt with. And if not, then the next chief will be probably short-lived. What year will you become eligible for retirement? We got 39 that said that they're currently eligible, and 55 of those that knew when they were retired. 55 said they were eligible within the next 3 years, noting that we are probably undersampling people that are eligible for retirement now or shortly. We probably would have gotten a couple more in that area, but it does certainly suggest that there's a large section of individuals within NOPD that are about retirement ready. Some of those are going to be there for a while more, that they may be retirement eligible, but they want to stay for more years. Some, I know that it's been talked about that there's going to be large payouts coming in the next year, in the next 12 months, really in the next 3 months. And so there's questions as to what will be done once those are received. Will officers that are eligible for retirement leave? And that's something that we're going to be measuring going forward very closely. I will note that the 72, and I'll get into the not planning to retire from NOPD question, but a large chunk of people stated that they were not planning to retire, and I just wanted to call that out. Because on the next slide, we see that it's largely the younger officers, the newer officers that don't see themselves retiring from NOPD. I don't know the degree to which this is an NOPD specific issue, or Gen Z and millennials, our generations. Just, I never saw myself staying anywhere for 30 years. So I can't begrudge an NOPD officer for not wanting to be anywhere for 30 years. But almost half of the police officers said that they were not, the PO ranks said that they were not planning to retire. versus less than 20% of lieutenants and sergeants. And I think all 4 of our captains said they are planning to retire, which makes total sense because if you've got 20 years in the department, you're a lieutenant. Why would you retire now if you can stay 3 more years and get retirement with full benefits? Similarly, those without 10 years, less than 10 years of experience, almost half of them said that they were not planning to retire from NOPD, compared to those with 20 years and up. Less than 10% of them said that they were not planning to retire from NOPD, which again makes sense. Why, if you've got 20 or more years, you're probably going to be there for 25 to 30 years. I do think that this is something that the department will have to grapple with, that the newer members of the department don't see this as a 30-year career. And that's something that companies across the country have to deal with. And this data pretty much lays clear that this is something that the police department is also going to have to deal with. The 30-year pension is not the selling point inherently that it maybe was 20 or 25 years ago. So then we asked on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being least likely, 5 being almost certainly, how likely each officer was to leave NOPD within a year, within 1 to 3 years, within 3 to 5 years, and then with 5 or more years. As you can see, there were 26 that said they were almost certainly going to leave within the next year. That would largely fit. I think we got 268 responses, 26 would be 10%. We have a 10%, 10 to 15% attrition rate. That's kind of what we would expect in a year, to have about 10% of them leave. So I think this matches very closely to what we would expect. The 1 to 3 years, I think, is a little scary because you got a large swath of officers that I think are there. There's going to be large payouts, and these retention bonuses, the degree to which they're able to actually keep officers there going forward, it's I think an open question. It's one we're going to measure, but I think it's definitely an open question, as opposed to when you look at, and we didn't poll them on retention benefits specifically, retention bonuses specifically, but you look at the concept of annual raises is what they're asking for. And it's unclear, absent those, the degree to which retention bonuses will keep an officer there after they've received them. So this is what we get for the 10 different benefits. On the left of the table is the benefit. The middle is the percent that said that it was a 5 out of 5, very important. Almost 9% said 2% longevity pay every year, a 2% raise every year, as opposed to, what is it now, every 5 years? And my understanding is it's just like the fire department gets 2% every year. So it's not like this is coming out of left field and is inherently something unreasonable that other first responders aren't receiving. Annual step increases, sick pay paid out 1-to-1 at retirement as opposed to 5-to-1 now. So I've learned a lot about NOPD's benefit system. And then equipment upgrades is the only non-pay one that is the non-pay one that got the most very important. But the top 3 are the only 3 that got above 80% of the respondents saying they're very important. Things like housing incentives for your subsidized childcare, aftercare. There are some that said that this was really important, and I don't want to suggest that nobody gave it a 5, or that nobody said that healthcare or childcare is not extremely important to them. But for most officers, these did not reach the same level. On the right, you can see the scores average, each person doing 1 to 5. Again, you kind of see this bunching of the top 2 are really the most important, the longevity pay and the step increases, and then sort of going down from there. I think to some degree, if you tell somebody here are 10 potential things you can get, you're going to say each one of them is important.
Right.
So I think that if we focus on what everyone's saying is the most important, that'll sort of give us the most benefit from these.
But let me also weigh in here, because this is so critical, the way that these results came out, because prior to this particular survey, I'll admit I was wrong. I was doing a lot of talking around the childcare piece, and I talked to Mr. Livacari about it, and he was like, oh, this could be something great, and it's like outside of the NOPD, I'd been saying like, this could be something that, creating these incentives would be something that I'm assuming everyone would want. And I saw what San Diego had recently done as well. But once we asked the officers, they were like, that's good. We like it, but it's not like our top thing. So this is just so key to really guiding us as to, wait, we're not within the department. What do the officers within the department actually want? And I feel like that's been the problem. There's been too many outsiders, whether it's the council, the administration, whoever else, trying to come up with what officers want, but never really asking them and never really listening to them. And I'll even say that, that comes to maybe even some of the very top leadership within the NOPD as well, which obviously now we saw within the survey that's reflected in the responses as well. So anyway, but when I saw the results of this, I was like, well, I was wrong. So
Hey, can I chime in?
yeah.
Because I was right. Because I said the exact opposite. I said that every officer, they are tired of the gimmicks for years of trying to avoid giving them actual increases to pay that go towards retirement. I think there's going to be as we dig into this deeper, there's going to be a direct correlation between why would I retire for a department when my pay once you get past a senior officer, your pay as a 15-year patrolman and a 5-year patrolman is the same pay. There's no increase. And you get to a point where I know Council President Moreno and I have been talking about, and we're working with Amy at Civil Service. If we don't tackle step pay to show a patrolman that there's actually a path to make money, there's no reason. Once you cap out, you're capped out. And I can't tell you, every 5 years when we give that 2% pay raise, it incenses senior officers who are like, the guy that just got here in 5 years and the guy that's been here for 30 years who didn't go through rank, they are getting paid the same amount of money. And it is the epitome of that let them eat cake argument, where you have people who are not involved in the department doing these managerial, they think, solutions like, oh, of course they want this. It's really simple. When you look at other law enforcement agencies around the region, they're all getting annual increases except for NOPD. And there's no surprise, like I said earlier, when we're talking about that unfortunate incident, officers are not leaving law enforcement, they're leaving NOPD. They're going to a different department. And so for those people, I think there was a gentleman in the 8th district who showed up and walked out the same day. And there was this whole effort to vilify him on walking out. And when you look at the fact that you're doing 12-hour shifts, you're getting paid the same amount of money, whether you've been there 5 years or 30 years, if you're not in rank, why? Why stay? If your family is tired of you coming home stressed, if you are dealing with mental health, the struggles, if you're dealing with dissatisfaction in the department, and you can go get laterally hired to Seattle with step pay and your pay will go up 30%, we're not making the case. So
if I can add something to that, now I agree with what you just said. We have 230 people who were hired in 1998 or earlier. Those 230 people will be eligible to retire in 2023 with between 83 and 100% of their salary. That's a lot of people if they decided to take advantage of their pension that they've already contributed to and go somewhere else and start working on a new pension.
Yeah.
There's another 159 officers who were hired between 1999 and 2003. So they would be eligible. They would have 20 years. So they could retire vested in the pension. Then they may or may not be able to collect it depending on how old they were, but they'd be able to collect it at some point soon. And so those are certainly things that we have to keep in mind.
Well, and just to follow up on that, Mr. McCarty, I think it's also important to note, one of the concerns many council members put out there was, with this one-time bonus in March, we will likely see a lot of people who are on the cusp of retirement that we're probably planning on being in this massive attrition this year, that really they're just holding out for the one-time payment. Because since that one-time payment does not affect their retirement and has no retirement benefit, once they take that payment and they're retirement eligible, I've heard candidly from officers who have over 20 years, that's my moving bonus or my thank you bonus. I was planning on retiring anyway. because I'm dissatisfied.
Well, my hope was that we would be able to use that time between announcing those bonuses and actually getting them
To fix the issue.
to come up with something that was a little bit more lasting, but yeah, and you guys are hard at work at it.
We're trying.
So can I comment on that?
Yeah, go ahead.
So
Dr.
one of the things that the officers say, the ones who have 20 or something years, they are going to retire because they're eligible for their pension, they're going to collect. But when you ask them, what is it going to keep you here? Do you know what the number one answer is? Money. Like they're already eligible. They're staying because of the bonus. And you ask them, what can we do to keep you here? And they're like, well, if I know I'm going to get something, and those officers are going to leave, but the officers that are here that still have 20 are like, are we going to get penalized because those officers are all leaving and now they're like, oh, the retention doesn't work. So it's a little.
Well, and I mean,
Yeah, I mean, so I think that if we would have just gone with, the top really
Yeah.
four, well, I would just say if we would have gone with if we would have just gone with the top four, the 2%, which is similar to what the state does, the annual step increases, which Councilmember Morel is currently working on with civil service, the sick pay, which is currently 5-to-1 down to 1-to-1, which you came up with, Detective, as something that you'd heard from officers to put in the survey, which, we're working on that piece. And then the equipment upgrades, which we passed, budget allocations for that. We would have just focused really on the basics instead of outside of NOPD kind of gimmicky things. We probably would be in a much better spot.
and I mean, to your point, I think we have to quantify when you say the money, like if you're giving people annual pay increases, your retirement's based on your top 3 years. If you're getting an annual increase, your best year is your next year. But if you're capped out and you're not going to get actual baseline increases, once your retirement caps out, you're just kind of hanging out at that point. And if someone comes along with a better offer, to your point, if I'm a sergeant, I'm a lieutenant, hell, if I'm a patrolman with 15 plus years, there are other departments that will laterally hire me in as a 15-year patrolman. And if they've got step, well, that's a lot of money. And I mean, as the council president said, not to be a dead horse, it's really simple. Just give people an annual pay raise. If you have a retirement system based on longevity and everyone's next year is their best year, they'll stay that extra, get that top 3 years if they're always increasing. Every 5 years is not a reason to stay.
There are a lot, and you're absolutely right, because officers are excited for the next 3 years because they're like, we're getting 5%. Imagine if they were to get something like you said, step increases and
The 2%.
2% every year. They'd be like, oh, well, this is going to my pension if I just
Right.
stay a little longer.
Right. Go ahead, Jeff.
Thank you. So this is the question I think I regret our wording on the most, just because we asked about the 12-hour shift as it relates to childcare responsibilities specifically. So what we found is sort of a marginal negligible change in how it has affected the childcare responsibilities, as well as marginal change in how it has affected stress. We did provide a sort of open-ended, please explain question. And so we got a mixture, I would say, of, hey, this is great. I have time to spend with my grandkids and, I have more days off and that's wonderful. Or, it's really hard to get my kids to school and it makes it a lot more difficult on me. So I do think that maybe if we do go to something like a quarterly tracking survey, this is something that we can track a little more specifically as to thoughts on the 12-hour.
12-hour shifts, because I know that it's been brought up several times during the meeting. Jeff, you and I have talked about actually doing, and I've talked to you, Donovan, about this as well, about doing an actual analysis on the effectiveness of 12-hour shifts, because studies in other parts of the country have shown that 4-day 12-hour shifts actually lead to more call-ins of sick days on the front end or on the back end, so that you're actually, having more people calling in sick. Therefore, is it really increasing the numbers of officers that you really do have out on the street? So I think working on that analysis to see, how the 12-hour shifts actually have increased or maybe not increased manpower, I think could be interesting, and to see kind of what's happened with the sick days as well.
Yeah, and we've talked about getting with civil service. And I think Andrew was gonna email them. I'm not sure where that stands, but I'll follow up and.
Perfect. Thank
in
you.
that.
And a quick question for Detective Augustine. A frequent exchange that I've had with the chief on 12-hour shifts is if we're doing 12-hour shifts, but we're not authorizing overtime, you're really just reshuffling the 8 hours you'd have over a normal work week. I'm trying to understand what is the manpower advantage if we have an officer, let's say for a 48-hour work week, and we're going 12-hour shifts, which means that we're shifting them to 4 days versus 5. You're not generating more police officers out of the air. You're just redistributing them based upon a 12-hour shift when you're not actually getting. I'm trying to figure out, and it's never been explained to us. As you know, the consultants don't speak to us because they work for the management, not for the council. But it's never been explained to me as a deployment strategy. If we're not excessively authorizing overtime, how many more extra hours are you actually getting out of officers?
Oh, I would not be able to answer that question.
Okay.
I just don't. I'm not on the 12 hours. I'm on the 8 hours. I wouldn't be able
Well,
to.
maybe Donovan, we can include that in the next survey, but I mean, I've had numerous conversations about the math. Just if we were told, I think last time, that overtime would be granted if asked, which wasn't really much of an answer. But when I asked specifically mathematically, if the set amount of hours per week per officer is with the goal is not to go over overtime, and we're simply redistributing their existing hours into a 12-hour shift format versus an 8-hour shift format, but they're working the same amount of hours, mathematically, how does that increase coverage?
We can do the math.
Okay.
We can, I mean, the way that I would measure it and what we have is we can measure sort of the median response time per hour of day. And what we see is that in the first part of the year, you kind of have 3 spikes, one at first shift change, second shift change, third shift change, and they're kind of medium sized. And then in May, when they did the shift to the 12-hour shift, we see that middle spike goes away and the 2 edge spikes go up. And so we can certainly measure the degree to which it affects having, are you sacrificing much longer response times for the 2 hours for sort of medium response times in the 3rd hour, and whether or not it's a net positive.
And I know from the incident that happened at the Superdome with the guy with a knife, I had communication with officers who explained the early car, late car situation between patrols to me. And a lot of officers reached out to me and said it illustrated the concern they had, that the reliance upon the earlier late car to respond to incidents while everyone is in roll call during those 12-hour shift changes, that those officers who are in the earlier late car, there are many instances in which they don't have necessary access to backup because everybody from the 12-hour shift was in roll call, and that was another concern. And I think these are the kind of logistical, like you're kind of getting into the weeds, but these are when officers are telling me these are kind of logistical loopholes that need to be closed, and that the idea that any officer is going to be riding alone in a car by himself for that hour of shift change as the earlier late car to cover roll call, that is a very dangerous hour for that officer who's in the earlier late car. And it's one of those things that when you have the 12-hour shift massive switching, it puts more pressure on that person who's in that earlier late car. So that's something else we should probably look into as well.
Yeah, and we can do that. We'll need some data from NOPD on the units available, but we can basically do average units available per hour of day. And that'll show you, at 6 a.m. per district in the 7th district, there's
Right.
1 car that's available on average versus at 8 a.m. there's 6 cars on average, or whatever that number might be.
Okay. Thank you.
Councilmember Thomas.
Yeah, I was trying as much as possible to save my voice a lot. We have a lot of good questions that have been asked. But as someone who's been part of teams and organizations, there are a few things you try to accomplish with surveys. You want to have a survey based on what the overall mission is, what the charter function of that agency is. And then usually also in surveys, especially when I've been part of teams, and whether in college or not, you had to evaluate your own performance. So was there any thought to, what, is there a part of here that asks the officer, like my coach would say, are you giving 100%? What do you think your performance is based on our record? What we're trying to do to win the division or the national title? Where are we? Was there some consideration on that? Because we can talk about how people feel, but in many cases, how they feel, especially when you're part of a team, based on my limited knowledge, also can be a reflection of the overall group. So is there somewhere we can, do you have that information? Or have we thought about that information?
We didn't include that specifically in the survey, but I think that would be an excellent question for a sort of quarterly tracking survey. So that you could measure that over time.
Well, all the questions are good, but as someone who's been part of a team, if everyone on the team isn't mostly committed to the mission or the goal based on their performance, their ability, their position within the organization, it will always hamper the outcome of the goal of the team. So hopefully in our next survey, especially since this is secretive and we're respecting the privacy of the people who participated, it would be nice to know how they feel about where they are in terms of their performance and what they're trying to do. The other thing is, since we have two law enforcement experts, how does this affect where we've been, especially over the last several decades, right? When you studied the New Orleans Police Department, at one point we had a homicide solve rate of less around 20%. I think the homicide solve rate now is like 45%, but the national average is 60%. I remember Mr. Parker one time, he was a one-man gang when you talk about car thefts and stuff like that. But because he didn't have more people in that unit, it was difficult to retrieve stolen cars or to solve those cases. So as it relates to this survey, how do you guys think it's going to impact, especially because even though we've moved up in homicide solve rate, we're still 20 percentage points below the national average. So for me, the survey is fine in terms of how officers feel about where they work, but I'd like to know about how they feel about the work they do and ultimately about attacking those homicide rates, robbery rates, domestic violence rates, rape rates, because consistently, if you look at the data as it relates to our department over the 40 or 50 years, we've lagged behind the national average. So ultimately, how do we use this to impact those areas? Excuse my voice.
So I think when we're talking about the officers and their goals, like you said, I've played in teams before. The officers have goals. It's just a matter of, do they have the equipment and the resources to be able to do that? If you look at some departments, some detectives don't have vehicles. So when you ask about like, how are they doing this? Well, if you give a detective, you don't give them a car to go and do their job, well, then of course, their solve rate and their investigations are going to be low. But if you give them the resources they need, they're going to be motivated to go out there and go do the job and do those things.
And that's what I was looking for, because then, Jeff, the other piece of the survey is, yeah, we want to know how people feel, but we want to know how they feel in terms of their performance and what they need to do that job, especially given statistically, if you look at, and you know those numbers over the last 40 or 50 years, consistently. So then I feel this way about the department, supervision, promotions, and transfers. But if these things were all a level playing field and I felt better about them, what do I need to respond more quickly? What do I need to retrieve that car? What do I need to get that carjacker? What do I need to get the homicide rate up to the national average? And I think ultimately that's what we want, I think.
I think that the immediate answer to that question is more policemen, and I think that that was the goal of this survey, was to.
Now, don't forget now, we had like a 20+% homicide solve rate at the height of the department several decades ago, though. When we're in the midst of 400, 300, and so. I mean, you know better than me, but I'm just doing some recall.
No, you're right. I mean, in the 90s, we had a similar manpower problem, and we we ran to hire and we created new problems in the early nineties, and we have to make sure not to repeat those same problems. I think that this survey, I think that the question about how people feel about their supervisors is at least one indication of how people feel about their team. I do think though that manpower is at the heart of some of these problems. I mean, the sex crimes units, for example, have caseloads that are outrageous. And there's really, I don't think you could expect anybody to work with those kind of caseloads, but that's not something that was explored in the survey, but the only way that we can reduce those caseloads is to add more detectives, but that would have to come, they'd have to come from somewhere else. So it's, that's the question, I assume.
Thank you. Thank you.
Councilmember Morrell.
Two quick questions. One is for Jeff. I think it's also important to note that there is some inconsistency in how the NOPD reports solve rates, because there is a national term. The national term is what? Clearance rate, correct? And then there is the police chief's term, which is solve rate. And it's important as we try to compare ourselves to national averages, we use the same terminology. And on multiple occasions in our interactions in this very chamber, when I've tried to get clarity on why there is a local solve rate versus the national clearance rate, I bring that up because one of the issues that we currently have that really gives me great concern is that there is an increasing attitude and appetite to play with statistics and numbers to downplay problems. I think that whether it's the consultants giving the opinion to NOPD to report less crime over social media to make it appear like there's less crime, I think that's a great service on two levels. The first is it lulls people into a false sense of security. And I do think that as long as we continue to have our crime problems in the city, I think that is important for people to have a heightened awareness of their surroundings and what's going on around them. The other issue, which is kind of, I think, was unforeseen by the consultants in making that argument, you have more people saying, well, if crime's down and solve rates are low, I guess the police aren't doing their job. And the reality is that our officers are dealing with a national trend as far as crime happening in cities across the nation. But as Detective Augustin just said, as Mr. Licari just said, morale and resources play a large part in the solve rates. In departments where officers are having a collaborative experience, where they're being led by innovative leaders who give them a sense of being on a team, working towards a common purpose, you see great results. When you're on a team where it's a blame game, where morale is low, where you feel like, and I understand there's some idea we should de-emphasize feelings, but morale in any militaristic unit, in a police department, the Army, the Navy, whatever, when morale is low, history will tell you whether it's Alexander the Great or whether it's the Romans or whether it's Patton during World War I. If morale is low, a superior force will lose to a smaller force. And with that, I think you should read the next slide because that talks about morale.
I will note,
Hang on, Councilmember Thomas,
Oh,
how to
yes.
follow it.
Human Perf and the National Council on Policing, there's a difference between how those agencies rate crime. Many of the national rating agencies are based on the performance of the police department, not crime. It happens with our citizens in terms of what the local departments try to solve. So we understand those differences there. But one of the things that has to happen when you talk about national solve rates as it relates to homicide, it has to do with the homicides within the citizenry, not police departments or within the offices in terms of what happens with a lot of the offices. So there are differences there. They outlined in PERF, they outlined in the National Council. And I just think that in terms of when you talk about some of the crime that's going on right now, as we move to not only the survey of the offices, we need to move closer to what it means in terms of solve rate in those categories where local departments are better at it than national agencies.
I'll just throw in for my part. This is something that we're tracking on a new dashboard that we're hoping to launch soon on police performance, which measures arrest rate in firearm murders and in non-fatal shootings. And so by using arrest rate, which is the numerator is the percentage of murders that have an arrest this year, murders that happened this year that have an arrest. The denominator is the number of murders that happened this year. So that combining those two, we are at 32.8% of the 250 murders this year have had an arrest, which is different from solve rate, where you can have, the NOPD officers have done their job.
And those are murders that occurred this year.
Murders that occurred this year. Yes.
And to be clear, and this is why I said numbers get kind of funny, when they report solve rates, they also include murders that were solved from previous years in that number.
Which is a national standard
Standard,
for
right?
clearance rates.
But we also have instances in which they'll do clearance by arrest. They'll do clearance by, if they identify an individual who, right, clearance by warrant, which means we have an idea of who the person is, but that person has not been arrested, hasn't been interviewed, but we consider that case solved because a warrant has been issued for an arrest.
Yeah, which is why I think for internal purposes, solve rate makes a ton of sense as far as what is, especially for the homicide department,
Right.
how many of these cases are we solving? It's out of our hands. But for
That's
the,
why I use that term.
yeah,
Right.
and it's something that the police department has used.
But,
You remember earlier in the year, we had
but where
discussions
the
about,
conflict arises is when you use a solve rate to match yourself to a national clearance rate or vice versa. Basically, the only time in which we've had conflict, I think, in this chamber over the terminology is if you're using an internal rate to track how you're following cases, then you take that rate and compare it to a national average that uses a different metric. It's disingenuous.
yeah, and that's why we're going to stick with arrest rate, because we can measure it consistently over
Right,
time.
right.
So I didn't mean to get us on this side.
No, I
needed to
don't
nerd out a
know.
little.
No, so how much clearance rate and some homicide solve rate, the national average is just an indicator of what local police departments are doing internally to deal with homicides. That's it.
Yeah,
No
absolutely.
confusion there.
Yeah, I apologize for dragging us down this rabbit hole.
You're good, Jeff, and thank you for your upcoming work in that. I think that the last couple of slides, in my opinion, I found to be really the most interesting, because once again, we were really just looking at kind of checking off some incentives. And I think what we found in the free comment section actually really opened up kind of a whole new kind of can of worms with the department. So go ahead on the last two.
Yeah, and I should note that in the PowerPoint, I've sort of messed up the chronology of when the officers saw these questions. Are you satisfied with the department and supervisor and promotion process? That all occurred right before this question. So that's the reason that most of these answers are focused on the promotion process. So we had 135 officers that responded in the, what do you think? Tell us your response. Explain your answers to your satisfaction. A large number of them, and again, they were sort of open-ended responses. So some of them were not capturing or don't fit neatly in a category. But a large number of them specifically mentioned one of favoritism, cronyism, or nepotism, specifically in the promotion process. 16 of them, it's called the knowledge skills assessment, and basically the promotion process, a joke, said it was unfair, or specifically said that it was based on who you know. We did get a tiny number of officers that expressed dissatisfaction with the consent decree, but there were only 3 that specifically mentioned the consent decree, a couple that mentioned the monitors, not inherently due to dissatisfaction, but we're talking about the monitors, the existence of the monitors. and sort of adding to their difficulties. This is largely in line with what we see in the exit interviews, as far as very little discussion of the consent decree. Lots of discussion about the things that affect the officers on a day-to-day process. And then I called out 3 responses that I thought were good, because I think it speaks to the passion and the dedication of the officers, that they want to serve the department, but that they don't have satisfaction with a lot of the things beyond their immediate control. And so I won't read these, but I'll leave them up for the rest of the discussion. And
Thank you, Jeff. In the previous slide that you had regarding promotions and transfers and the comments that we received, I remember when we were in my office looking at the results in the draft report that you brought to me, I guess about a week ago, and I was sitting with you, Detective, and you know, I was like, wow, I can't believe these answers. And Detective, I remember you kind of looking at me like, well, that's actually what you hear all the time.
Yeah, and I think it was very important to put the add your comment so that way you can see exactly what these officers are going through. And if this is only 135 responses, imagine the other responses from the people who didn't respond. And they're all around the same thing. Everyone just wants fair. They just want things to be fair. And you know, the survey shows that things are not fair. But, you know, and I remember in the budget hearing, Councilman Thomas had mentioned that in the course of the decades of the survey, that everyone says the same thing. Well, if everyone's saying the same thing every year, we should be able to do something about it.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and you know, speaking about, you know, team and goals, right? So if you have a goal to be promoted, yet you feel that to be promoted is not necessarily based on your qualifications, your ability or your skill, but based on who you know, right there, your personal goals, in your opinion, maybe being shot down. And so that leads to, you know, additional morale issues. I'm sure that's part of the dissatisfaction piece of the survey, Jeff. So I thought that this piece was really, really telling and troubling, because once again, and I said this earlier, we can throw whatever incentives and we can try to do all that we can with pay, but until we really change the culture of the NOPD, we're never going to win the battle over manpower issues.
And if I may add, so I'm in the Air Force. I've been in for 18 years. And we know what we need to do to get promoted to the next rank. You have to do this, it's on paper. You do this, and this. If I want to be in any position or anything, there's no guidelines on where you got to go. And I think a lot of officers, they may want to go to a certain position, but there's no, I mean, what's the guideline to get there? Except, you know, oh, I put in a KSA. Or even if someone has goals of being a captain of a district or a lieutenant or a sergeant, it's like, what are the steps that those officers need to take in their career to get there that they can work on from the very beginning? And we don't have that laid out. And if officers knew what they needed to do, they would work towards it, and they would stay here and want to make a difference.
But see why the whole selection process on the next chief has to be so open and transparent, so that people really can see that it's based on qualifications. Councilmember King, and then Morale.
And with that comment made by Councilmember Moreno, is it possible to do a survey where you ask NOPD officers who would they want to see as the next chief, or not necessarily a person, but what type of the process? Do they want a local person? They want somebody national? They're going to ultimately work for or work with the new police chief. So does that make sense to even think about doing that?
It does make sense. And the officers getting their opinions, I think, is important to them. They want to know that their voice is being heard. And so just putting a survey out there and asking them, that there's no harm in doing that. You're just getting the opinion of the officers who've been in. You're going to get officers from 30 to 1. You're going to get their opinion. And that's the most important. They want their voices to be heard. They've never been heard before. No one's ever done something like this where it's to the city council and it's out there.
So is that something that you all can do a small survey, just get their thoughts? and maybe we
Look, if you want to partner up again, I'd love to work with Councilmember King on trying to put some type of questionnaire together on that and getting
Yeah.
it out as quickly as
Yeah.
possible. If you guys are
and we can
amenable
give that to the
something.
mayor. Give that to the
Results
mayor.
to the mayor,
Yeah,
yeah.
get the results. to
Yeah,
the mayor.
I think we'd have to work on that, to determine some type of structure and,
Sure.
how, how the question would be asked and formatted and I don't think you could ask an open-ended question, but
Yep.
if it was reduced to a smaller number of people, I don't know, that's a tough one. I think we could work on it though.
If it's possible.
Certainly.
Let me know, Ms. Ashton, fraternal order of police if you'd like to help and be a part of it.
Yes, sir.
Councilmember Morrell.
And just a quick point. So going back to I believe it's your third slide. When you talk about the satisfaction overview and the satisfaction with your supervisor, I think it's important to give that some context. When you're looking at 209 responses across the field of officer you selected, I think it would be appropriate to say that the majority of these officers are likely talking about a sergeant. Would that be correct, Detective Augustine?
Yes.
Because I don't want people to extrapolate that when they say I like my supervisor, that means I like management. When you have the rank structure and the distribution of officers, the immediate supervisor of the vast majority of officers, the first rank is sergeant. So many of these officers on a regular basis don't interact with someone above the rank of sergeant other than a roll call situation, correct?
Maybe lieutenants.
Maybe lieutenants. But so for the most part, I just want to highlight that number. So that 209, the vast majority of those people are talking about the lowest rank in management, which is sergeant, which is the most plentiful position. I think it's also important when we talk about promotion opportunities, and I appreciate you using the military as an example, as far as like having a clear delineated path. I mean, obviously people don't like to hear this, but I mean, if you are in the military and you have a goal of becoming a captain or a major or the like, there is a process. If I meet these benchmarks, I meet these goals, I get there. And for a lot of people, that's what keeps them in the military, because they have a goal. I think that when you don't have a clear promotional process, and especially when you look at our structure, there's a fixed number of positions at all ranks. And so not only do you have to work towards being a lieutenant or a captain, there are only certain instances in which that rank becomes available. So the window of opportunity is even smaller. So when you see that massive dissatisfaction with who you know, cliques, and cronyism, it's even more devastating, because you might be on the force for 10 years and only 2 captain spots come up. So if you don't believe from Jump Street you've got a clear chance to get there, and there's only a chance 2 will come up, then it really is demoralizing, because it's not like the department is growing at such a space, and with the constraints civil service puts on it. I mean, beyond the rank of sergeant, the opportunities for promotion are very, very competitive. And if there's not a clear, transparent process, you likely will not. I mean, most officers don't see a promotion beyond senior officer, and that's it. And I mean, once you've hit that goal on the team, and there are other teams that are saying, well, you could come to a different department and meet those dreams you had of becoming a lieutenant, a captain, a major. I know we only have one here. We only have one major in NOPD. That's could be also for being about our one major. But when you take away the possibility of achieving goals on one team, that's when trades and free agency happens. And that's kind of what's been happening with this year with our attrition at NOPD. I appreciate y'all being here. I look forward to other council members' comments.
If I may, real quick, Councilmember Green. We actually, in the accompanying analysis, broke down each question by rank. And we do see that 90% of the police officer rank approve of their sergeant or satisfied with their sergeant, compared to 68% of sergeants approve of their supervisor. And with the promotional process, 14% of police officers, 26% of senior police officers approve of it. Just 8% of sergeants and 6% of lieutenants approve of the promotional process. As you mentioned, they're sort of stuck.
And you know, I think if I just one last thing real quick, I'll try to make this short. When we talk about the promotional process, I mean, you know, it's about how the lists are made and how people are selected for promotion as opposed to the actual process, like transfer processes about how like the KSAs are implemented as opposed to the actual process that, you know, that goes along with transfers. But on the last captain's exam, you know, the tests that civil service staff are created to try to indicate who would be the best individuals in that position that they're testing for. But we've of course gone beyond that. The whole Great Place to Work initiative, which was implemented in in the early 2010s, I think. We had in the last captain's exam, they had 1, 2, 3 people that went up 10 spaces on the list. They had 2 that went down 9, 1 that went down 8. I mean, that's a lot of spaces to move when you're only, I mean, the captain's exam is not a very large list.
Like the college football playoff.
It's and then I think they want to
How many that went down were Burkhardt or Glazer?
that, you know, I think that they want to do like these structured interviews, but I'm not sure that they're quite doing structured interviews, you know, and I think that they're trying to do something, but I think that they're not quite there. It's just that I think that causes a lot of frustration and a lot of questions about the promotional path and you know, career path in general. But thank you.
Councilmember Green?
I'm not gonna do my long usual discussion of how the police have
Every time you
responded
say that, you do.
so quickly in the last couple of instances, because actually there's been some sad out there. But I do want to say this. This may be a unique opportunity for the city council to take these concerns and get it right. We're going to be involved with the selection process involving the police chief. We are. At the end of the day, we are. One way or the other, we are. We also have a report here that actually, Jeff, if I had this report at the beginning of last year, maybe when we were looking at budget for this year, I would have been making some suggestions based on what I see here, longevity. But the things that other council members have mentioned are within our power. We also have the power to work with civil service to see these changes. So this council should take ownership of whether or not we make those improvements. We should take responsibility. And then at the end of 6 months, if the changes haven't been made, then look back at what we haven't done to make these changes. I see all of these suggestions. I think they're fine. I think that they can enhance morale. I will give you one little caveat to that I've been around government for a while, but it was 25 years ago. Some of the concerns that I hear officers talk about with regards to cronyism and things like that were what I heard under what I consider to be a pretty good police chief, even in Pennington. And I don't think that he did that. I think that that's just the nature of a lot of promotion. But if we're going to try to be like the military and make it clear as to what the promotional process is, if we're going to have the longevity pay increases, and look, that's not off the table for now, because honestly, we're going to lose some officers still. So we may not spend as much money on the bonuses and things like that. Maybe we need to look at longevity pay increases right now, more so than ads running in different publications. Let's give the right. Let's put it into the things that officers are saying that they absolutely positively need. But I do want to say this. As a council, I'm willing to work with the other members of the council to take ownership of this year. To not push things further down the road. If these are what our officers are saying right now, and I think that a survey of this number of officers is a pretty good process in terms of the numbers. I think that we have funds available to do this. We haven't even spent all of the funds. Right? We're gonna need civil service, and Councilman Thomas is right. However, we're gonna get civil service if we want it. We're gonna get them on our side. There are some things that we can do as a council to make it happen. So I just want to tell you that I appreciate this survey. I appreciate the depth of it. I appreciate your research. I'm willing to take ownership of this in addition to the selection of a police chief, to working with the police leadership to see these things happen, putting pressure on civil service, making the money available so that it's not the can pushed down the road again after the next few months.
Thank
So I appreciate.
I do apologize also. I do apologize for not having this last year. This would have been certainly very helpful.
You know what I mean? Like, what I meant was,
Yes,
Jeff,
of course.
it wasn't asked for then. It was asked for now. And look, we move forward. This council is 1 year old. So the bottom line is that there was a time that we were gonna get the information, and it's here now. So, I mean, you may be joking, but I want to make it clear. That's not what I mean. That
Absolutely.
we didn't ask for it last year, but we didn't ask for it at the beginning. I would have known, maybe that was something that we would ask for, but this is the time to start it. 2023 is when we take ownership of this as a council and we make these things happen. I'm ready.
And to answer your question, Councilmember Green, about like, why now? I think all of us had constantly been asking, how did the incentive package come together? How did that come together? And it was like, well, we talked to officers. Well, but it's like, where is that information? Where is that data specifically? And it was never really ever, at least not provided to me.
Right.
So that's where, we stepped in with Jeff and FOP. It's like, well, let's get our own data. And then this is what we got. Not to mention that I was also trying to find outside the box things that I thought were going to be effective. And as I noticed that maybe they're not exactly what the officers wanted. So there we go. So that's why we wanted to do this particular.
Finally, an
survey.
opportunity to attack systemic change
Mhm.
and take a holistic approach and
Yeah.
come up with the solutions that the public wants. So I think we have that document.
And you know what, Councilmember Thomas, too, Mr. Chair, I think some of the things that we found in this survey are really kind of low hanging fruit that we could take care of very quickly. So, well, once again, thank you to all of you. I don't have any public comment cards, anything online?
We have one online.
One
comment.
online? Go ahead, Anita.
This is from Val Coopit. Val says, as long as the city officials keep supporting the criminals over law abiding victims, we will continue to see the downward spiral. Quality of life begins with a safe New Orleans. Police will continue to lead with your protect the criminals mindset. We sit in our homes wondering, when did it be okay to do wrong? Quit blaming the police. It's the judges, DA, and all those that think they owe these criminals a second, third chance. Teach the young that wrong will not be tolerated. Each of you are responsible for this madness. You need to get mad at anyone that thinks it's okay to prey on your residents. Do a roundup of all those that want to prey on us, property crimes, as well as offenses against persons. Yes, let us arrest ourselves out of this murder capital, crime-ridden city. You can turn this around. Give property tax breaks to those that want to help prosecute the criminals to attract more lawyers. Get serious, council members. How many crimes, all crimes, total in NOLA for 2022? We need help. What about the victims?
Thank you, Anita. All right, there's no other public comments. We appreciate all three of you so much. Thank
Move
you.
adjournment.
Second, all in favor? Aye, we're adjourned.
Right, you're working on a quarterly survey.
Yeah.